from animals, machines, and even angels. It is the most precious and most terrible gift that humans possess, and it is the source of both our greatest glory and our deepest misery. To understand Dostoevsky's philosophy of freedom, you must first understand what he means by the word. When most people think of freedom, they imagine the ability to do whatever they want without interference. They think of freedom from external constraints. But Dostoevsky is talking about something much more fundamental and much more disturbing. He is talking about the freedom to choose between good and evil, the freedom to act against your own self-interest, the freedom to destroy yourself and others for no rational reason whatsoever, the freedom to say no to God, to happiness, to love, to life itself. This freedom is not optional for human beings. We cannot give it up even if we want to. Even when we try to surrender our freedom to authority figures, political systems, or religious institutions, we are still making a free choice to surrender. Even when we claim that our actions are determined by genetics, social conditioning, or unconscious drives, we are still freely choosing to accept that deterministic explanation. Freedom haunts every human moment. It lurks behind every decision, no matter how small or seemingly automatic. We are condemned to be free, and this condemnation is the source of human anxiety, guilt, and existential terror. Why would anyone want such a terrible burden? Why would a loving God curse human beings with such a frightening responsibility? Because without freedom, goodness would be meaningless. A robot programmed to help people is not morally praiseworthy. An animal acting on instinct to protect its young is not exhibiting virtue. Only a being who could choose evil but freely chooses good deserves moral credit. Only a being who could reject love but freely chooses to love is capable of genuine love. Only a being who could despair but freely chooses hope is exhibiting real courage. But here is where Dostoevsky becomes truly radical. Most human beings, he argues, cannot handle this level of freedom. It is too terrifying, too burdensome, too overwhelming. Most people, when faced with genuine freedom, will do anything to escape it. They will surrender their autonomy to political leaders who promise to take care of them. They will adopt rigid ideologies that tell them exactly what to think and feel. They will lose themselves in addictions, distractions, and mindless pleasures. They will do anything to avoid the terrible responsibility of having to choose who they want to be. This creates a fundamental tragedy in human existence. The very thing that makes us human is the thing that most of us desperately want to escape. We want to be free, but we do not want the responsibility that comes with freedom. We want to make choices, but we do not want to face the consequences of our choices. We want to be good, but we do not want to struggle with the temptation to be evil. We want love, but we do not want to risk the vulnerability that genuine love requires. Dostoevsky illustrates this tragedy through the underground man, one of the most important characters in all of literature. The underground man is a former government clerk who has withdrawn from society and spends his time writing bitter notes about the nature of human existence. He is highly intelligent, deeply self-aware, and completely miserable. He understands exactly what he should do to improve his life, but he refuses to do it. He sabotages his own happiness, destroys his relationships, and wallows in his own suffering. Why does he do this? Because it is the only way he can assert his freedom. By choosing to be miserable, he proves that he is not a machine programmed for happiness. The underground man would rather suffer as a free being than be happy as a slave. This is the essence of human perversity that Dostoevsky discovered. We will choose suffering over happiness if suffering is the only way to prove our autonomy. We will act against our own interests simply to demonstrate that we are not predictable. We will embrace irrationality as a form of rebellion against any system that tries to reduce us to logical formulas. We are willing to go to hell as long as we can choose hell for ourselves rather than having heaven imposed upon us. This insight has profound implications for politics, psychology, religion, and every other area of human concern. Any system that tries to perfect human beings by eliminating their capacity for free choice will ultimately fail. Any ideology that promises to create happiness by removing the possibility of choosing unhappiness will produce rebellion and resentment. Any political program that treats people as rational actors who will always choose their own self-interest will be surprised by human perversity. Any psychological theory that tries to explain all human behavior in terms of deterministic causes will miss the irreducible element of freedom that makes us human. But Dostoevsky does not stop with this negative insight. He also shows us what freedom looks like when it is exercised in the service of love rather than rebellion. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov and Prince Mishkin demonstrate that it is possible to freely choose goodness, compassion, and self-sacrifice. These characters are not weak or naive. They understand the full horror of human existence, the reality of evil, and the temptation to despair. But they freely choose to respond with love anyway. This choice is not determined by their genetics, their upbringing, or their social circumstances. It is a free act of will that transcends all natural and social causation. This positive freedom is not easy to achieve. It requires tremendous spiritual strength, moral courage, and willingness to suffer. It cannot be programmed, taught, or legislated into existence. It must be chosen freely by each individual in the depths of their own soul. And it must be chosen again and again, moment by moment, throughout an entire lifetime. This is why Dostoevsky believed that freedom is ultimately a spiritual rather than a political or psychological category. True freedom comes not from the absence of external constraints, but from the presence of internal grace. It is the freedom to love even when love is not returned, to forgive even when forgiveness is not deserved, to hope even when hope seems impossible. The path to this higher freedom leads through suffering, and this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Dostoevsky's philosophy for modern people to accept. We live in a culture that views suffering as an unmitigated evil to be eliminated through technology, therapy, or social reform. But Dostoevsky argues that suffering is often the only way that human beings learn to exercise their freedom responsibly. Suffering breaks down our illusions of self-sufficiency and forces us to confront the deepest questions of existence. It strips away our pretenses and reveals who we really are beneath all our social masks. It teaches us compassion for others who suffer. It opens our hearts to the possibility of redemption and transformation. Without suffering, we would remain spiritually immature, incapable of genuine love or authentic choice. Part 2. The Underground Mind and Modern Consciousness. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would become the archetypal figure of modern alienation. The underground man is not just a literary creation. He is a prophetic vision of what human consciousness would become in the modern world. He represents the first fully self-aware neurotic in literature, a man whose intelligence has become his curse and whose self-consciousness has paralyzed him completely. When you understand the underground man, you understand the psychological condition of millions of people living today. The underground man begins his confession with words that have echoed through philosophy and psychology for over a century and a half. He declares himself to be a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. But these are not mere insults he is hurling at himself. They are precise diagnoses of a new form of human consciousness that was emerging in the modern world. He is sick with excessive self-awareness. He is spiteful because his intelligence has revealed the futility of human existence. He's unattractive because his hyperactive mind has made him incapable of natural, spontaneous human connection. The underground man's fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. In earlier ages, people could act on instinct, tradition, or religious faith without endless self-questioning. But the underground man has been exposed to modern education, scientific thinking, and philosophical skepticism. He cannot accept anything on faith. He cannot act on impulse without analyzing his motives. He cannot make any decision without seeing all the possible objections to that decision. He is trapped in what we might now call analysis paralysis, but Dostoevsky understood this condition decades before psychologists gave it a name. This excessive consciousness creates a terrible problem for action. The underground man knows exactly what he should do to improve his life, but knowing and doing are two completely different things. He should exercise, but he analyzes his motives for exercise until the impulse dies. He should socialize, but he anticipates every possible social embarrassment until he talks himself out of leaving his apartment. He should work on meaningful projects, but he questions the ultimate value of all human endeavors until he becomes paralyzed by nihilistic doubt. Intelligence, which should be humanity's greatest gift, has become his greatest curse. But the underground man's problems go deeper than mere overthinking. He has also lost the ability to feel genuine emotions. Everything he experiences is filtered through multiple layers of self-consciousness until the original feeling is completely distorted. When he feels angry, he immediately begins analyzing his anger, questioning its legitimacy, anticipating how others will judge it, and wondering about its deeper psychological causes. By the time he finishes this analysis, the anger has transformed into something completely different, usually self-hatred or bitter resentment. He cannot experience any emotion purely because his mind immediately begins dissecting and critiquing every feeling. This creates a fundamental alienation from his own inner life. The underground man feels like a stranger to himself. He watches his own thoughts and feelings as if they belong to someone else. He becomes divided against himself, with one part of his mind constantly observing and judging the other parts. This internal division makes authentic self-expression impossible. Everything he says or does feels artificial and calculated because it has been filtered through so many layers of self-consciousness. The underground man also suffers from what we might now call social anxiety. But again, Dostoevsky understood this condition long before it became a recognized psychological category. The underground man desperately wants human connection, but his self-consciousness makes normal social interaction almost impossible. When he enters a room full of people, he immediately begins analyzing how they are perceiving him. He notices every facial expression, every tone of voice, every gesture, and interprets them all as evidence of rejection or contempt. He becomes so focused on managing his image that he loses all ability to be genuinely present with other people. His attempts at conversation feel forced and awkward because he is constantly monitoring himself rather than simply responding naturally. This social anxiety creates a vicious cycle that traps the underground man in deeper and deeper isolation.
I appreciate it.
Because he feels awkward in social situations, he begins avoiding them. But the more he isolates himself, the more awkward he becomes when he does venture out. Eventually, he develops elaborate theories about why other people are inferior and why solitude is actually preferable to human company. These theories are really just defense mechanisms designed to protect his wounded ego, but he convinces himself that they represent sophisticated philosophical insights. He transforms his psychological problems into intellectual positions. The underground man also exhibits what psychologists would later call cognitive dissonance. He holds contradictory beliefs and desires simultaneously, and the tension between them drives him to increasingly irrational behavior. He claims to value reason above everything else, but then acts in completely irrational ways. He insists that he wants to be left alone, but then becomes furious when people ignore him. He declares that he despises society, but then becomes desperate for social approval. He proclaims his independence from conventional morality, but then tortures himself with guilt over minor transgressions. These contradictions are not accidental or temporary. They are built into the structure of modern consciousness itself. The underground man has been educated to believe in reason, individual autonomy, and scientific materialism. But human beings are not purely rational creatures, and these modern ideologies cannot satisfy their deeper emotional and spiritual needs. The result is a permanent state of internal conflict between what the underground man thinks he should believe and what he actually experiences. His mind has been modernized, but his heart still yearns for meaning, connection, and transcendence. Dostoevsky shows us that this conflict leads to a peculiar form of suffering that is distinctly modern. In earlier ages, people suffered from poverty, disease, war, and natural disasters. These forms of suffering were terrible, but they were also comprehensible and shared. The underground man suffers from something much more subtle and isolating. He suffers from the inability to believe in anything, to feel anything purely, or to connect authentically with anyone. He suffers from the loss of meaning, purpose, and genuine emotion. This is the suffering of modern alienation, and it is in many ways more devastating than physical hardship, because it attacks the very core of what makes life worth living. The underground man's response to this suffering is both pathetic and prophetic. Unable to find genuine meaning or connection, he begins to cultivate his suffering as if it were a work of art. He develops elaborate theories about why suffering is superior to happiness. He convinces himself that his alienation is actually a sign of his superior sensitivity and intelligence. He transforms his psychological problems into badges of honor. This is exactly what happened to many intellectual movements in the 20th century, from existentialism to postmodernism to various forms of identity politics. When people cannot find positive meaning, they often begin to find meaning in their victimhood, their alienation, or their rejection of conventional values. But Dostoevsky does not simply diagnose the problem of modern consciousness. He also suggests a solution, though it is not an easy one. The underground man's problems stem from his excessive reliance on rational analysis and his disconnection from deeper sources of meaning. He's lost touch with his capacity for faith, love, and self-transcendence. These capacities cannot be recovered through more thinking or better psychological techniques. They require a fundamental reorientation of the soul towards something greater than the individual ego. The underground man must learn to stop analyzing himself long enough to actually live, to stop protecting himself long enough to love, and to stop asserting his autonomy long enough to surrender to something transcendent. This is why Dostoevsky believed that the crisis of modern consciousness was ultimately a spiritual crisis rather than a psychological or social one. No amount of therapy, education, or social reform could solve the underground man's problems. He needed a complete transformation of his relationship to existence itself. He needed to rediscover the possibility of wonder, reverence, and genuine human connection. But this transformation could not be achieved through willpower or intellectual effort. It required grace, and grace comes only to those who acknowledge their own helplessness and open themselves to redemption. Part 3. The War Against Rationalism and Scientific Materialism. When Dostoevsky looked at the intellectual trends of his time, he saw humanity rushing headlong towards spiritual catastrophe. The 19th century was the age of scientific progress, rational enlightenment, and utopian social planning. Intellectuals across Europe believed that human reason could solve all problems, eliminate all suffering, and create perfect societies. They thought that science would replace religion, that education would eliminate ignorance, and that proper social organization would end poverty, crime, and conflict. To most educated people of his era, these beliefs seemed obviously correct and morally admirable. But Dostoevsky saw them as dangerous delusions that would lead to unprecedented human destruction. The fundamental error of rationalism, according to Dostoevsky, is its misunderstanding of human nature. Rationalists assume that people are essentially logical creatures who make decisions based on careful calculation of their self-interest. They believe that if you can show someone what is truly in their best interest, they will naturally choose to pursue it. If people behave irrationally or self-destructively, it must be because they lack proper education or live in corrupted social conditions. Fix the education and reform the social conditions, and human behavior will automatically improve. This view seems reasonable and humane, but Dostoevsky recognized it as a catastrophic misreading of human psychology. The problem is that human beings are not primarily rational creatures. We are emotional, spiritual, and often deeply irrational beings who frequently act against our own self-interest for psychological reasons that have nothing to do with logic. Sometimes we choose to suffer because suffering feels more authentic than artificial happiness. Sometimes we reject good advice because accepting it would require admitting that we need help. Sometimes we embrace destructive behaviors because they give us a sense of power or autonomy that we cannot find in healthy activities. And sometimes we simply act on impulse, instinct, or unconscious drives that operate below the level of rational awareness. Dostoevsky illustrates this point through countless examples in his novels. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment commits murder, not because it serves his rational self-interest, but because he wants to prove that he is extraordinary enough to transcend moral law. The underground man sabotages his own happiness, not because he lacks knowledge of what would make him happy, but because choosing misery is the only way he can assert his freedom. Ivan Karamazov develops elaborate philosophical arguments against God, not because the evidence clearly supports atheism, but because he cannot bear the emotional burden of believing in a God who permits innocent suffering. In each case, the character's behavior is driven by deep psychological needs that have nothing to do with rational calculation. This insight has devastating implications for all utopian political schemes. If people do not behave rationally, then rational social planning cannot create perfect societies. If human behavior is driven by unconscious psychological forces, then conscious education and reform cannot eliminate antisocial behavior. If people sometimes choose suffering over happiness for existential reasons, then no amount of material improvement can guarantee human contentment. Rationalist reformers are trying to solve human problems with tools that are fundamentally inadequate to the task. They are like doctors trying to cure mental illness with surgery, or engineers trying to fix human relationships with mathematics. But Dostoevsky's critique goes deeper than simply pointing out the limitations of rational planning. He argues that excessive reliance on reason actually makes human problems worse rather than better. When people try to live purely rational lives, they cut themselves off from their own emotional and spiritual depths. They become like the underground man, trapped in their own heads, unable to feel genuine emotions or make authentic connections with other people. They lose touch with the sources of meaning, beauty, and transcendence that make life worth living. Rationalism does not solve the human condition, it impoverishes it. Scientific materialism creates even more serious problems. When people begin to view themselves as nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and chemical laws, they lose their sense of human dignity and moral responsibility. If all human behavior can be explained in terms of genetics, neurology, and social conditioning, then concepts like free will, moral choice, and personal accountability become meaningless. Why should anyone feel guilty about their actions if those actions were determined by forces beyond their control? Why should anyone strive for moral improvement if morality is just a social construction with no objective reality? Why should anyone sacrifice their immediate desires for higher principles if there are no higher principles, only competing biological drives and social pressures? Dostoevsky saw that scientific materialism would ultimately lead to nihilism, the belief that nothing has any ultimate meaning or value. If human beings are just accidental products of blind evolutionary forces, then our lives have no inherent purpose or significance. If consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry, then our deepest thoughts and feelings are nothing more than chemical reactions. If moral values are just social constructions that evolved to promote group survival, then they have no binding authority over individual behavior. The logical conclusion of scientific materialism is that existence is fundamentally absurd and that all human striving is ultimately meaningless. This realization drives sensitive people to despair and less sensitive people to ruthless pursuit of power and pleasure. The political implications of this worldview are terrifying. If there are no objective moral truths, then might makes right. If human beings have no inherent dignity, then they can be manipulated, exploited, and destroyed without moral qualms. If traditional values are just arbitrary social constructions, then they can be swept away and replaced with whatever ideology serves the interests of those in power. If reason is the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals have the right to impose their rational schemes on everyone else, regardless of what ordinary people want or believe. Dostoevsky recognized that this combination of nihilism and rationalism would eventually produce totalitarian movements that would treat human beings as raw material for social engineering projects. His novels are filled with characters who embody this dangerous combination of ideas. Raskolnikov believes that exceptional individuals have the right to transgress moral law for rational purposes. The characters in Demons are willing to commit murder and terrorism in service of their revolutionary ideologies. The Grand Inquisitor argues that the masses cannot handle freedom and must be controlled by an enlightened elite. In each case, Rational arguments are used to justify irrational and immoral behavior. The characters convince themselves that they are serving higher purposes, but they are really serving their own psychological needs for power, significance, and revenge against a world that has wounded them. Dostoevsky also understood that rationalism and materialism would fail to satisfy the deepest human needs. People need meaning, purpose, beauty, love, and transcendence. They need to feel that their lives matter in some ultimate sense. They need to believe that their moral choices have real significance. They need to experience wonder, reverence, and connection to something greater than themselves. Rationalism and materialism cannot provide these things because they explicitly deny their reality or importance. A worldview that reduces everything to matter in motion cannot account for consciousness, beauty, love, or moral obligation. It leaves people spiritually starved in the midst of material abundance. This spiritual starvation creates a terrible emptiness that people try to fill with various substitutes. Some become addicted to pleasure, excitement, or novel experiences. Others lose themselves in work, achievement, or the accumulation of wealth and status. Still others embrace political ideologies that promise to give their lives meaning through identification with grand historical movements. But none of these substitutes can truly satisfy the human need for transcendent meaning. They provide temporary distraction from the underlying emptiness, but they cannot heal the spiritual wound that rationalism and materialism have created. Dostoevsky's alternative to rationalism is not irrationalism or anti-intellectualism. He was himself a highly intellectual and well-educated man who engaged seriously with the philosophical and scientific ideas of his time. His critique of reason was based on reason itself, but he insisted that reason must be balanced by faith, emotion, and spiritual intuition. Human beings need all of their faculties working together in harmony. Reason without faith becomes cold and destructive. Faith without reason becomes fanatical and superstitious. But reason guided by faith and grounded in spiritual reality can serve human flourishing. This is why Dostoevsky placed such emphasis on the role of suffering in human development. Suffering breaks down our intellectual pride and forces us to confront realities that cannot be understood through reason alone. It opens us to the possibility of grace, redemption, and spiritual transformation. It teaches us humility and compassion. It connects us to the deeper mysteries of existence that rational analysis cannot penetrate. A person who has never suffered deeply will likely remain trapped in the illusion that life can be mastered through intelligence and willpower. But a person who has been broken by suffering and then healed by grace will understand that reality is far more complex and mysterious than any rational system can capture. Part 4. The psychology of evil and human darkness. One of Dostoevsky's most disturbing insights was his recognition that evil does not come primarily from ignorance, social conditions, or external circumstances. Evil comes from the human heart itself. This was a revolutionary and deeply unpopular idea in the 19th century, when most intellectuals believed that human nature was fundamentally good and that evil behavior resulted from corrupted social institutions. If you could eliminate poverty, improve education, and reform social structures, they argued, you could eliminate crime, violence, and moral corruption. But Dostoevsky had seen too much of human nature in its raw form to accept such optimistic theories. He knew that evil was far more mysterious, persistent, and deeply rooted than social reformers wanted to admit. Dostoevsky's understanding of evil was shaped by his own experience in the Siberian prison camp, where he spent 4 years among murderers, thieves, and other violent criminals. He expected to find that these men had been driven to crime by desperate circumstances or lack of proper education. Instead, he discovered that many of them had committed their crimes not out of necessity, but out of choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others appeared to have committed murder or robbery as a form of self-assertion or rebellion against social authority. Still, others seemed to have been motivated by a desire to experience the ultimate transgression, to see what it felt like to cross the line that separates civilized behavior from absolute barbarity. What disturbed Dostoevsky most was not that these men were evil, but that they were recognizably human. They were not monsters or beasts, but people who shared the same basic psychological makeup as everyone else. They had the same capacity for reason, emotion, and moral understanding as law-abiding citizens. Many of them were intelligent, some were charming, and a few were even capable of genuine kindness in certain circumstances. But they had made fundamental choices about how to live that had led them down dark paths. If people like this could become violent criminals, then the potential for evil existed in everyone. This realization forced Dostoevsky to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are not blank slates who become good or evil depending on our environment. We are not rational calculators who always choose what serves our best interests. We are complex beings with contradictory impulses, including genuine impulses toward evil. Every human being contains the capacity for both sainthood and criminality. Which path we take depends not primarily on our circumstances, but on the moral choices we make in the depths of our souls. Dostoevsky explores this theme most powerfully through the character of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is an intelligent, sensitive young man from a respectable family. He has received a good education and holds progressive social views. He is not driven to crime by poverty or desperation, though these factors play a role in his situation. Instead, he chooses to commit murder because he wants to prove to himself that he is an extraordinary individual who can transcend conventional morality. He has convinced himself through rational arguments that killing a worthless old woman and redistributing her money to deserving poor people would be a morally justified act. But Dostoevsky shows us that Raskolnikov's rational justifications are really elaborate self-deceptions. The real motivation for his crime is psychological rather than philosophical. He wants to experience the ultimate assertion of his own will and power. He wants to prove that he is not bound by the moral rules that constrain ordinary people. He wants to feel what it is like to hold the power of life and death over another human being. The murder is not really about helping the poor or serving some greater good. It is about feeding his own ego and satisfying his deepest psychological needs. What makes Raskolnikov so disturbing is that his psychological profile is not fundamentally different from that of many intellectuals and political activists. How many people have committed terrible acts in the name of serving humanity? How many revolutionaries have justified murder and terrorism by claiming to serve the greater good? How many ideologues have convinced themselves that their personal resentments and power drives are actually noble commitments to justice and progress? Raskolnikov represents the dangerous combination of intellectual sophistication and moral blindness that characterizes so many modern movements. He is the prototype of the educated person who uses rational arguments to justify fundamentally irrational and evil behavior. Dostoevsky also understood that evil often emerges not from dramatic moral failures, but from small compromises and gradual spiritual deterioration. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to become criminals or tyrants. Instead, they make a series of seemingly minor moral compromises that slowly erode their capacity for ethical judgment. They tell small lies that prepare them for bigger lies. They rationalize minor selfishness that prepares them for major selfishness. They ignore small injustices that prepare them to participate in larger injustices. Over time, these compromises create a pattern of moral numbness that makes serious evil possible. This process is illustrated brilliantly in The Brothers Karamazov through the character of Smerdyakov, who murders his father Fyodor. Smerdyakov is not born evil, but he grows up in an environment of moral corruption and cynicism. He observes the hypocrisy and selfishness of the adults around him, and he gradually learns to manipulate others for his own advantage. He develops a philosophy of nihilistic opportunism that justifies any action that serves his interests. By the time he commits murder, he has already lost any genuine capacity for moral feeling. The crime is simply the logical culmination of a lifelong process of spiritual deterioration. But Dostoevsky's most profound insight into the nature of evil concerns its relationship to freedom. Evil is not an unfortunate accident or a temporary aberration that can be eliminated through proper social engineering. Evil is an inevitable consequence of human freedom itself. If people are truly free to choose between good and evil, then some of them will choose evil. If people have the capacity for genuine love, then they also have the capacity for genuine hatred. If people can sacrifice themselves for others, then they can also sacrifice others for themselves. Freedom necessarily includes the freedom to choose wrongly, and this means that evil can never be completely eliminated from human existence. This does not mean that we should be passive in the face of evil, or that we should not work to reduce suffering and injustice. But it does mean that we should not expect to create perfect societies or eliminate the possibility of moral failure. Any political system that promises to end evil through social reform is either naive or dishonest. Any psychological theory that reduces evil to mental illness or social dysfunction is missing something essential about human nature. Any religious or philosophical system that tries to explain away the reality of genuine moral choice is denying the fundamental truth about what it means to be human. Dostoevsky also recognized that the attempt to eliminate evil often creates worse evils. When people become convinced that they can perfect human nature through rational planning, they often become willing to use extreme measures against those who resist their plans. If crime is caused by social conditions rather than individual choice, then criminals are not responsible for their actions and do not deserve punishment. But those who perpetuate the social conditions that cause crime become the real villains who deserve whatever fate the reformers choose to impose on them. This logic leads inevitably to the persecution of anyone who stands in the way of social progress. The attempt to create a perfect society ends up producing societies that are far more evil than the traditional societies they replace. The characters in Demons illustrate this process perfectly. They begin with genuine concerns about social injustice and a sincere desire to help the oppressed. But their commitment to revolutionary ideology gradually overwhelms their basic human decency. They become willing to lie, steal, and murder in service of their cause. They convince themselves that their personal hatred and resentment are actually noble commitment to justice. They end up becoming far more destructive than the social problems they originally set out to solve. Their attempt to eliminate evil from society has turned them into agents of evil themselves. The only realistic response to the problem of evil, according to Dostoevsky, is spiritual rather than political or social. We cannot eliminate evil through better institutions or improved education. We can only combat evil through individual moral and spiritual transformation. Each person must confront the capacity for evil within their own heart and choose to struggle against it. This struggle never ends and never achieves final victory in this life, but it is the only way to maintain our humanity in the face of the darkness that surrounds and pervades us. And occasionally, through grace and genuine repentance, it can lead to real redemption and transformation. Part 5. The problem of innocent suffering and Ivan's rebellion. No philosophical problem tormented Dostoevsky more deeply than the existence of innocent suffering. How can a loving and all-powerful God permit children to be tortured, abused, and killed? How can we believe in divine justice when the world is filled with undeserved pain and seemingly random cruelty? These questions strike at the very heart of religious faith and moral understanding. Most religious thinkers try to answer them with theological explanations about free will, the greater good, or the mysterious ways of divine providence. But Dostoevsky was too honest and too deeply acquainted with suffering to accept easy answers. Instead, he presented the problem of innocent suffering in its starkest and most emotionally devastating form. The most powerful statement of this problem comes through the character of Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan is a brilliant intellectual who has studied philosophy, theology, and history. He understands all the traditional arguments for the existence of God and the standard explanations for why a good God permits evil. But he has also collected stories of innocent children being tortured and murdered by adults. These stories are not abstract philosophical examples, but detailed accounts of real human suffering that Ivan has gathered from newspapers and historical records. When he confronts the reality of this suffering, all theological explanations collapse into meaninglessness. Ivan tells his brother Alyosha about a 5-year-old girl whose parents tortured her for minor infractions. They would beat her, lock her in an outhouse overnight in the freezing cold, and force her to eat her own excrement. The child would pray to God for protection, but no protection came. Eventually, her parents tortured her to death. Ivan asks Alyosha a simple but devastating question. Can you understand why a little creature who cannot even understand what is being done to her should beat her little heart with her tiny fist in the dark and cold, weeping tears to God for protection? And what can we say about a God who hears such prayers and does nothing? Ivan presents many such stories, each more heartbreaking than the last. A general orders his hunting dogs to tear apart a peasant boy because the child accidentally injured one of the general's favorite hounds. Turkish soldiers in Bulgaria entertain themselves by throwing babies into the air and catching them on their bayonets. Parents across the world beat, starve, and sexually abuse their own children while the children cry out for help that never comes. These are not isolated incidents, but patterns of cruelty that have repeated themselves throughout human history. Every generation produces new examples of innocent suffering that seem to make a mockery of any belief in divine justice or cosmic meaning. The standard religious response to such suffering is to say that God works in mysterious ways that human beings cannot understand. Perhaps the suffering serves some greater purpose that will be revealed in the afterlife. Perhaps it is necessary for the development of human character or the achievement of some greater good. Perhaps the suffering will be compensated by eternal happiness in heaven. But Ivan rejects all such explanations as morally obscene. No greater good could possibly justify the torture of innocent children. No eternal compensation could make up for undeserved agony. If the achievement of some cosmic harmony requires even one child to suffer unjustly, then Ivan wants nothing to do with such harmony. Ivan presents his rejection of God's world in terms that are both logically rigorous and emotionally overwhelming. He tells Alyosha that he does not reject God himself, but he cannot accept the world that God has created. He refuses to participate in any cosmic plan that is built on the foundation of innocent suffering. Even if he could be shown that all suffering will eventually be justified and all injustice will be made right, he would still reject the ticket to such a universe. Some things are simply too precious to be sacrificed for any purpose, no matter how noble. The tears of a tortured child cannot be wiped away by any amount of future happiness or cosmic justice. This position is not atheism in the ordinary sense. Ivan is not arguing that God does not exist or that religious claims are factually incorrect. He is making a moral argument against the universe itself. Even if God exists, and even if there is a divine plan that will ultimately make everything right, Ivan refuses to endorse such a plan. He would rather be damned than participate in a cosmic system that treats innocent suffering as an acceptable means to any end. This is rebellion not against God's existence, but against God's justice. Ivan's rebellion culminates in his famous parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition and begins performing miracles and healing the sick. The Grand Inquisitor, who represents the highest authority of the Catholic Church, has Jesus arrested. He visits Jesus in his prison cell and explains why the Church must reject and execute him. The problem is that Jesus offered humanity freedom, but freedom is a burden that most people cannot bear. The Church has corrected Jesus' mistake by offering people security, certainty, and relief from the terrible responsibility of having to choose for themselves. The Grand Inquisitor argues that Jesus was wrong to reject the three temptations offered by Satan in the wilderness. Satan offered to turn stones into bread, representing the promise to solve human material needs. Jesus rejected this, insisting that people do not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor points out that most people are not spiritual enough to care about anything beyond their physical survival. By refusing to solve the problem of hunger and poverty, Jesus condemned the majority of humanity to perpetual suffering. A truly loving God would have chosen to feed people rather than preserving their spiritual freedom. Satan also offered Jesus the chance to prove his divinity by throwing himself from the temple and having angels save him. This represents the power of miracle, the ability to compel belief through supernatural demonstrations. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that faith must be freely chosen rather than forced through overwhelming evidence. But the Inquisitor argues that most people desperately want certainty and are tormented by doubt. By refusing to provide irrefutable proof of his divinity, Jesus left humanity to struggle with agonizing questions about the existence and nature of God. A truly compassionate God would have provided clear evidence that would eliminate all doubt and give people the security of certain knowledge. Finally, Satan offered Jesus dominion.